Sowing Seeds in the Desert by Masanobu Fukuoka. Chapter 2. Reconsidering Human Knowledge. The human race first appeared on Earth a couple of million years ago, and we began living what people generally consider civilized life several thousand years ago. In Japan, however, people began living a civilized life only in the last few hundred years. With the rapid development of science and technology, without our even having time to figure out where we are going, it seems that modern civilization has peaked and that disorder is emerging on a worldwide scale. But is the conclusion to this unfortunate chapter in human history inevitable? What will happen to the world in the future? The birth of discriminating knowledge. From the time that a child sees the moon floating in the sky and says, "I see the moon," human knowing begins. When a child first becomes aware of the moon, that child is simply filled with wonder. Then after a period of time, the child learns to discriminate between a subject, I, and the object, the moon. The child comes to know the thing called the moon as other. So even in the structure of human language, human beings are taught to set themselves apart from nature. The intimate and harmonious relationship between people and nature that once existed, which we can see in children's instinctive wonderment, becomes cold and distant. Even if we say that we know the green of nature, this is merely the understanding that discriminates green from other colors. If we have not grasped the intrinsic greenness of the grasses and trees, which originates with the life at their core, we cannot say that we really understand what true green is. People simply believe that they understand by making a distinction based on the outer appearance. If knowledge of a whole, one, is broken into two and explained, then these are divided into three and four and analyzed. We are no closer to understanding the whole than we were before. When we do this, however, we come under the illusion that knowledge has increased. But can we say that by endlessly repeating our divisions and analysis, and then gathering up all the fragments, we have advanced human knowledge in any meaningful way? No matter how much we accumulate, synthesize, and make judgments, this effort is not useful for clarifying the true state of things. Furthermore, it throws us into confusion. Once people create a mental image of the moon takes concrete form, and we want to know the moon, and then discover more and more about the moon. This desire eventually leads to actually traveling to the moon and retrieving stones to bring back to Earth for further research. The next thing you know, we are building space stations, and who knows what else might follow. With increased knowledge comes an increased desire for more knowledge, and then people work and work to invent machines to help them achieve even greater knowledge. But even if proof is found, only more questions will arise from that so-called proof. The desire for knowledge becomes endless, and we lose sight of our place in the world. In the end, the true essence of the moon is more clearly seen through the eyes of a child. Darwin's theory of natural selection. Darwin's theory of natural selection gives a good illustration of the principle that although the discriminating knowledge of science may seem useful for taking nature apart and analyzing the fragments, it is of no use for grasping the reality of nature. The Darwinian theory of evolution breaks down the 4.6 billion years since the Earth came into being, observes the living things that came into existence at certain times and places, and examines their mutual relationships. Based on this, the diversification and systematic development of the organisms are inferred and classified, and this is all developed into his theory of evolution. In other words, when oxygen and water formed on the planet, which in the beginning was apparently an inorganic mass, primitive life forms began to appear. These evolved and new life forms appeared. At first, extremely simple microorganisms such as fungi and bacteria were born. Then they developed and branched out. Organisms of other forms were born, and gradually the more complicated higher plants and animals began to multiply upon the earth. The idea is that the life forms on Earth came into being in sequence, along with the development of the earth itself. Various life forms appeared and lived as part of the food web, but only those that successfully adapted to their environment survived. This is known as the theory of natural selection, the theory of the most adaptable, and sometimes popularly referred to as the survival of the fittest. Among all the life forms, those that are selected by nature and survive the struggle for existence obtain the right to live and reproduce. One question I have about this theory is, what basis was used to determine which species are higher or lower and which are strong or weak? To decide that the phenomenon of the survival of the fittest is the providence of nature, and that people are the highest, most evolved species, seems to reflect more the strongman logic of human beings than the true state of nature. Actually, no one can say which species is the strongest because all living things depend on one another to survive, reproduce, and eventually decompose, so life can go on for all. It is true that all forms of life, by necessity and by natural design, consume one another to live, but they do not intentionally bring about another's extinction, systematically deprive other species of their source of food, or create factions and wars. The same cannot be said for human beings. In nature's cyclical rhythms, there are no grounds for the discriminatory view that underlies Darwin's view of superiority and inferiority that deems single-celled organisms as lower and more complicated life forms as higher. It would be more appropriate to say we are all one continuous life form. Whether you see differences between butterflies and moths, dragonflies and fireflies, depends on whether you are looking at the big picture or the small one. In the eyes of children, frogs, fish, birds, and squirrels all appear to be the same friends, but the eyes of adults are drawn to the differences in appearance and form, and so they appear to be different animals. Viewing the world macroscopically or microscopically simply means that different scales are being used, depending on whether you use human time, measured in minutes and seconds, or eternal time of the Ganges River, or whether your field of vision is as narrow as the inside of a box or as wide as the universe, the appearance of the world changes completely. Similarly, there is a common belief that there is a great difference between living and non-living things, but even that distinction occurs only because of one's perception. Understanding true time and space. The common sense understanding of time is that it is a direct, linear flow from the past through the present to the future. Darwin's theory of evolution is based on this idea of human historical time. The organisms are classified into fragments in time and location and systematized. The systemization emphasizes the differences among them. Species that were originally brothers and sisters became divided in people's thinking by being made into distinctly different things. Transcendent time, or time as it exists in nature, is a continuous moment of the present. When one sees and operates within that time and space, it is the unity of all things that's perceived. The idea of time that people generally accept came into being with the invention of the calendar and the clock. But a clock, with its needle going around a series of numbers, is just a means of counting. Time does not simply flow mechanically in a straight line or fixed direction. We could think of time as flowing up and down, right and left, forward and backward. As time develops and expands, multifaceted and three-dimensional, the past is concealed within the instant of the present, and within this instant of time is concealed the eternity of the future. It is easy to liken the flow of time to the flow of a river, but even the phenomenon of water flowing in a river presents a challenge of perception. When you stand on a riverbank and look at the water, you can clearly see that the water is flowing in one direction. But if you are in a boat moving at the same speed as the water, the river does not seem to be flowing at all. Rather, the riverbank appears to be moving upstream. As the Zen master once said, the river does not flow, the bridge flows. The rising and sinking of genes. Many years ago, when I was a young man working as a microbiologist, bacteriophages, viruses that infect and consume bacteria, were discovered. They were said to be the first known non-living things that reproduced. I was quite interested in them as some intermediate matter between living and non-living things. By now, of course, research on viruses has further blurred the boundary between living and non-living things. When looked at from the standpoint of their elemental particles, the distinction between animate and inanimate, living and non-living things, plants, animals, viruses, gases, and minerals, becomes inconsequential. The fact that the structure of DNA and the genetic code by which this genetic material is translated into protein is the same for all living things indicates to me that all living things are fundamentally related. These proteins could be seen as the liaison. These proteins could be seen as the liaison between living and non-living forms, and so play the role of threads tying the living and non-living together. So while there seems to be a great difference between plants and human beings, their genetic material is the same. Whether something becomes a plant or human being is just a question of whether or not the genetic factor for greenery surfaces or sinks. In fact, only a small portion of the combinations of the four genetic elements have successfully come into being, while most of the other combinations have been lost or are dormant. The reason that there are so few intermediary forms between species and that we cannot find fossils of them is not necessarily because they did not exist. Rather than saying that the genes that became intermediate species have not functioned at all, we can only assume that even if they were born, they died in infancy and did not come to the attention of human beings. That is why different, seemingly disconnected species and varieties are left. It is like an acacia tree that produces millions of seeds, each with its own distinctive genetic makeup. Few of them actually germinate and thrive. After 10 years, perhaps only 1 or 2 trees will survive as the descendants of the parent tree, but all the other trees that did not survive were also possible. Take the islands of Japan's Seto Inland Sea for another example. The many islands in this sea have various shapes. They have been given different names and they appear to be separate islands, but they are all connected at the bottom of the sea, so you could consider them the same single island of Japan. On a larger scale, of course, one could say that they are connected to all the islands and continents in the world by being part of the Earth's crust. In the same way, the animals and plants living on Earth appear to be different, but they are all connected at the base. Whether the genes survive, surfacing like islands floating in the inland sea, or do not, sinking beneath the water, depends on the arrangement of the genes and on the constant rearrangement of subatomic particles.